Oklahoma City bombing, which was last April 19. But of course, by the time April 19, 2020 came around, we had another tragedy that was holding people's attention. So there was really not nearly as much recognition given to that anniversary as I kind of hoped that there would be, and I thought that there should be, just for the sake of the people whose lives were changed by that event. So it means a lot to me this spring to know that the Texas Center for the Book has selected All of a Sudden and Forever as one of its titles for their Read Across Texas Community Read program on the theme of recovery. So this is All of a Sudden and Forever: Help and Healing After the Oklahoma City Bombing. Sometimes bad things happen and you have to tell everyone. Sometimes terrible things happen and everybody knows. One April morning in 1995, one of those terrible things happened in Oklahoma City. There was a man with a bomb in a big truck. He parked the truck in front of a big building in the middle of the city. He walked away. The bomb exploded. 168 people died. All of a sudden and forever, so much was ruined. The awfulness of that moment can never be undone. But the awfulness of that moment is not the end of the story. It is true that many people were hurt in many, many ways. Some lost a cousin, a niece, a nephew, an uncle, an aunt, a grandfather, a grandmother, a sister, a brother, a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, a baby named but not yet born. Some lost friends, neighbors, folks they used to see every week or every day. It is true as well that some who survived had their bodies broken in ways large and small. Some suffered damage to their minds and spirits. Some who rushed in to help saw horrible things they would never forget. Some had to leave nearby places they loved, homes, churches, a library, without knowing when they could safely return. And it is true that some found their lives flooded with anger, grief, or fear. Some came under suspicion for no good reason. Some had to accept that their own child was a bomber or had kept secrets for someone who was. Some lost hope that anything would ever be okay again. Many, many people around the world watched the tragedy and felt their own hearts break. And then, not all at once, but one by one, they turned to look at other things instead. But it is also true that all the while, one tree stood near the bombed building. This tree, an American elm, had not been much to look at before the bombing, though it did give off some shade. The blast had scorched the elm, blown debris into its branches, and left it looking worse than ever. Investigators collecting evidence considered cutting down the tree, but it was spared. It received help. Even after the building was gone, the tree survived. During the next year, people dealt with their pain in different ways, but healing doesn't always come easily. Many whose lives have been changed by the bombing asked why. Why me? Why us? Why them? Why? While waiting for an answer that may never come, many vowed to remember. They vowed to tell their stories. Their stories would keep alive those they had lost. Those stories, told and retold, would make sure the past had a place in the present. Many learned to piece their lives back together, even when important parts were gone forever. Some needed lots of help, and they received it from lots of people. Some of those helpers themselves were hurting, maybe from the bombing, maybe from something else that had happened to them before. Helpers often know how it feels to be in need, and they know from their own difficult times what kinds of aid might be needed. Families, survivors, and helpers came together. They talked, they listened, they cried, and sometimes even laughed. They made right what they could and began looking to the future. Some took solace under that elm tree that had survived. When the next spring came and new seeds fell from the survivor tree's branches, someone thought to collect them. Something could be done with those. The seeds were taken to a nursery where helpers planted them, not all at once, but a few seeds at a time. While the seeds sprouted and grew, so did plans for a memorial at the place of the bombing. It would be a monument to what had been lost, but also to the community of those still living. None of them had been hurt in exactly the same way, yet they all could seek some healing in this place they had in common. As time went by, they each might encounter others in their lives, on occasion or every morning, ready for them to just move on, to stop being sad, to stop being angry, to stop being hurt. At the memorial site, they believed they would always find someone willing to listen. They could always find someone willing to be with them. This was especially true each anniversary. When they gathered there for the second one, they found more than listeners, friends, and loved ones. They found survivor tree seedlings, grown from the seeds harvested the previous spring. There were enough seedlings for families of those who had died to take one home to plant. In front yards and backyards where everyday comings and goings mixed with memories from before the bombing, those seedlings took root and started to grow. Sometimes those elm trees were reminders of loss. Sometimes they were sources of comfort. Sometimes they were both. Many people whose lives had been changed by the bombing found new connections with each other. These included friendships, other close relationships, and at least one marriage that never would have happened if not for that terrible something they wished had never happened at all. After 5 years, the memorial opened to the public, followed by a museum. The stories they told brought visitors from around the world. A new crop of seeds got collected each spring. Over the next year, they would sprout into seedlings. At the anniversary gathering the following April, those seedlings would go to more homes, farther and farther from the original survivor tree. And when other terrible things happened, they just do. We can't stop them all. When these other terrible things happened and people died or were hurt or had their lives changed all of a sudden and forever, they received help too. Sometimes that help came from Oklahoma City. Some of those who had needed so much help after the bombing, even some of those who still needed help themselves, came forward. They provided comfort to those hurting in other families, other cities, other states, other nations. They listened to the stories of others. They shared their own. And before they returned home to Oklahoma City, sometimes they left behind a reminder of that comfort. Sometimes they left behind a seedling from the survivor tree. There will come a time, many, many years from now, when those people whose lives changed the instant of the Oklahoma City bombing will no longer be with us. Not all at once, but as decades pass, they will be gone. Likewise, the survivor tree itself will not live forever. No tree ever does. But its seedlings have been planted near and far. Those have grown into trees that have given off their own seeds. And just as the survivor tree's offspring have spread, so has the story of the tree and its survival. In various ways, this one tree with a meaningful place in our past will always be with us. The same is true of the people who first took solace from the survivor tree. After they are gone, some of those they comforted will remain among us, continuing to comfort others, who themselves will comfort still others, who will be around to comfort still more. And because of the stories so many of us have shared, we will remember the help so many needed. We will remember the help so many received. We will remember the help so many provided. We will remember. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for taking such a tragic event and weaving a story of love and hope, and especially for our young readers. That's truly a gift that you have. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate that, Diana. Thank you.
So next we're going to hear from Preston Lewis. He is the author of more than 30 Western historical and juvenile novels. Lewis has received 2 Spur Awards and 3 Will Rogers Gold Medallion Awards for written humor and short stories. He is known for his comic westerns, including the award-winning Bluster's Last Stand and The Fleecing of Fort Griffin. Lewis is past president of Western Writers of America and the West Texas Historical Association, which named him a fellow in 2016. Lewis holds degrees in journalism from Baylor and Ohio State Universities and a master's degree in history from Angelo State University. He and his wife Harriet reside in San Angelo. Thank you. Welcome, Preston.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with so many fine writers. Wanted to start today with a couple of brief selections from two of the novels in my comic Western series, The Memoirs of H.H. Lomax. And the first one will be from the aforementioned Bluster's Last Stand. It is based on largely a viewpoint on George Armstrong Custer, who's one of the most polarizing figures in American history. Most people then, and even historians today, either loved him or hated him. I tended to fall in the latter category, and this is the viewpoint of my protagonist, H.H. Lomax. My aim was to shoot George Armstrong Custer, not to make him famous. Maybe I shot him and maybe I didn't. I never knew, because it was hard to confirm if you hit your target when hundreds of screaming Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were also firing at him and at me. But the fact is, I held more rancor for Custer on that hot, dusty day in June of 1876 than I did for the Indian braves committed to scalping me. In the end, you might say that God and the devil saved me from the fate of the other white men on the hill above the Little Bighorn that afternoon. I didn't care for Custer, general or colonel or lieutenant or whatever rank he was. Fact was, I called him General Bluster because there weren't enough mirrors in the world to adequately reflect his opinion of himself. And my low opinion of the man did little to narrow the waistline of his bulging vanity. In fact, he relished telling me how superior he was, him being of Yankee descent and attending West Point, while I was a poor Southern boy with a narrow education. I could read, I could write, and I could think. Custer could too, but he liked to read about himself, write about himself, and I imagine if I could have read his mind, he liked to think about himself as well. Fact was, if you ordered 1,000 sons of bitches from a Chicago mail order house and received only him, you'd mark your invoice received in full. Much as I despised the man, I had to admit he was a god on horseback, him and his steed becoming one galloping machine. In fact, about the only thing in my mind, at least, that could have made him look even better on horseback was if he rode the mount over a cliff. So that was the first selection. A second one I want to do was from First Herd to Abilene. This is, in essence, sort of a trail drive novel, but it covers several years and a lot of characters in the West. I chose it because it sort of tweaks Texans, and you know, we're big enough to take it. So this is how First Herd to Abilene starts off. Over the years on the frontier, I came to loathe Texans more than any creature on two legs or four. Fact is, by charting the first major cattle trail to the railheads in Kansas, I made Texans rich, but I never got so much as a thank you from a single one of those Texas cattle kings. Even worse, I received nary a cent for all the hard work I put in and all the risk I took to chart the route to Kansas. If I'd built a toll gate along the Lomax Trail and charged a nickel a head for every steer that trumped my path to the railroads, I'd lived out my life in luxury. That, however, was not to be. Not only did wealth pass me by, but also the credit for my accomplishment, as the trail came to be named after Jesse Chisholm, an old coot who never traversed the route from Kansas to South Texas and back. Even Joseph G. McCoy denied me proper recognition when he wrote of the early years of the trail driving era in his book, Historic Sketches of the Cattle Trade of the West and Southwest, never once mentioning me. If I hadn't spread word to the Lone Star State about his plans for Abilene, McCoy would have never seen a Texas Longhorn, much less profited from one. Besides making the acquaintance of Chisholm and McCoy, I also made an enemy of Wild Bill Hickok, who threatened me over a misunderstanding after he had rescued me from an impromptu lynching in Kansas. It didn't matter that I'd likely saved him from shooting himself when we first met. and that I even combed nits out of his lousy hair at one point. When I finally faced Hickok after years of running from both his threats and the despicable rumors he had started about me, the reprobate might have survived if he had been paying more or paying less attention to me and more to the unsavory characters around his deadwood poker table. Some folks claim Calamity Jane saved me from Wild Bill, though I disagree. She was little more than a distraction to us both. Calamity Jane did take a fancy to me, most likely to make Wild Bill jealous, but I never cared for her as I considered Calamity the homeliest woman I'd ever laid eyes on. If you could assay ugly, she'd work out to $100 per ounce in her early days and 5 times that much in her later years. On top of that, her mouth was no prayer book because it was usually filled with whiskey or profanity so rank she could make Satan blush. Much as I dislike those folks, it was the Texans, though, that angered me most. They were brash and arrogant, proud that they could call theirs the biggest state in the Union. Nobody, though, called Texas the smartest of the states. If Texans had been bright, they'd have found Abilene, Kansas, without me having to do it for them. All they had to do was ride north until they encountered 2 parallel lines of iron rails over a bed of cross ties. That, however, was beyond their limited mental capacity. Thank you.
Thank you for making us laugh this morning. That was fun.
My pleasure.
Bryan Washington is going to share his work next. He is the National Book Award 5 Under 35 honoree, an NBCC Award finalist, and winner of the Dylan Thomas Prize and the Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. He received the New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award for his first book, Lot, which was also a finalist for the NBCC's John Leonard Prize, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, and the Aspen Words Literary Prize. He has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Times Magazine, BuzzFeed, among other publications. His best-selling debut novel, Memorial, was a GMA Book Club pick, a New York Times notable pick, one of Entertainment Weekly's 10 best books of the year, and a finalist for the NBCC Fiction Prize. He lives in Houston. Welcome, Bryan.
Hi, thank you, Diana. So I'll actually be reading a little bit from Memorial. Hopefully there's not too much preamble I have to give because the narrator is a young man who is staying with his maybe partner's mother, but neither of them expected to be in that situation. Yeah. The next morning, for the very first time, Mike's mother knocks on my door. She's fully dressed while I lean on the doorway in a tank top and boxers, and she says, "Take your time. Jesus Christ." We leave 5 minutes later. Our Black neighbors wave from their porch. There's a question on the grandfather's face, and I wonder if he'll ask it. But Mitsuko doesn't look away. If anything, she walks slower, staring him down. Mike's car is filthy with clothes, our hoodies and socks and a loose pair of shoes. The whole thing smells like him, and I know that his mother smells it too. When I toss a pair of shorts behind us, she grunts, and there's a jockstrap in the back seat, and I pray to no God in particular that Mitsuko doesn't catch it. We've pulled out of the neighborhood and into town when she says, "You're sure the store will have what I need?" "They should," I say. "You and Mike make the same things." "Maybe similar," says Mitsuko, "not same." We drive through the mix of locals beginning their day. Whole swaths of Houston look like chunks of other countries. There are potholes beside gourmet bakeries, beside taquerias, beside noodle bars, copied and pasted onto a graying landscape. At a stoplight, these 2 smiling guys walk a toddler across the street, holding the little girl's hand on either side. One of them is white, the other one's brown. They look like something straight out of Outsmart. I glance at Mitsuko, and her face doesn't tell me much. "So," she says, "you're Black." "You noticed," I say. "Just barely," says Mitsuko. "And how did you find my son?" "Accidentally," I say. "Let me guess," says Mitsuko. "It was Grindr." "No," I say. "You found my son on the internet," says Mitsuko. "No, we met at a get-together. An acquaintance introduced us." "Right," says Mitsuko. Once the couple crosses the road, their daughter looks up at them, beaming. She is the happiest that a child has ever been, ever. If Mike had seen them, he'd feign some sort of choking, or he'd honk his horn, or he'd go sober, not saying very much at all. Our local H Mart, the grocery store I bring Mitsuko to, is inconceivably closed for the day, and the next grocery store I bring her to is objectively filthy, but there's nata. There's a metal detector by the entrance. The doorway is flanked by a fried chicken vendor and scrubs. Older women and their children finger carrots on our left, and a little girl wandering the aisles wears a branch of parsley like a crown. I drift around looking for a shopping cart, and I find one with 3 wheels. We end up filling the whole thing, and also the basket, and also the crooks of Mitsuko's elbows. At the register, I feel for my wallet, and I wait for Mitsuko to stop me, but she doesn't. So I pull out my card, slowly, and that's when Mitsuko plucks a bill from her bag, shaking her head. The girl behind the register laughs, tugging at a bird. Just like a man, she says. Isn't it? Says Mitsuko. In the parking lot outside, a pair of women in jobs are yelling. Everything they say is punctuated with a gasp. Everything is horrible. They're both close to tears, but then they fall on top of each other, laughing until they're breathless. The next morning, before I go to work, Mitsuko says she needs a ride downtown. She mailed herself ingredients from Japan to the FedEx building by the Marriott. So we pull out of the neighborhood and off I-45, dodging the never-ending construction on Elgin. And as I hook a ride at a stoplight under the bridge, a disheveled guy in a rocket sweater sips from a paper bag. He's seen better days, and the sweater's brand new. It's got the tags and everything else. So he nods our way, and I nod back. Then the light changes, and we both turn back to our lives. Mitsuko says, "Tell me something about my son that I don't already know." Well, I say, but the thing is, I don't have anything. Mike is irritable. He's short-winded. He knows how to do this thing with his tongue. Mike knows a little bit of Spanish, I say. That's nice, says Mitsuko. He has to, I say, for his job. Also, I say, he's really into food. Thank you for that, says Mitsuko. Really, you are a wealth of knowledge. But tell me, she says, when did you know you were gay? I take my eyes off the road, nearly swerving onto the sidewalk. Some loiterers in shades hop away from the curb. They flick me off through the rearview window. Never mind, says Mitsuko. Sorry, I say, it wasn't you. Of course it wasn't me, says Mitsuko. We resettle into traffic. If it helps, she says, I had no idea Mike was that way, because he never told me, or his father. I had friends whose children were gay, sons who sleep with sons, girls who sleep with boys and girls, but not my child. I didn't see it. And then, says Mitsuko, I just knew. One day, before he left home, it just clicked. Everything finally made sense, and there was nothing to say after that. We both understood. Now, cruising into the parking garage, we find a spot just across from the elevator. Once I've settled the car and parked, we sit in the darkness. I ask, what kind of person did you think your son would end up with? Mitsuko says, is that your real question, or are you asking something else? Are you asking if I thought the man would be Japanese? Or if I care that you're black? A white guy emerges from the elevator in front of us, looking extremely distressed. He fumbles with the keys for a second, and at the sound of his car alarm, his whole body relaxes. I say, well, if you put it that way, and Mitsuko says, well, I didn't think about that. That wasn't my business. It isn't my business. I'm his mother. Or, says Mitsuko, are you actually asking what I really think about you? Another white guy in a suit unlocks the car behind us. He peeks into my window, frowning above his tie. I'd tell you, says Mitsuko, but you might drive us into the wall. I trail Mitsuko as we walk past the suite, up an escalator and over a crossway. The staff in the FedEx are mostly women, mostly black. They look at Mitsuko. They look at me. A light-speed calculus blips across their eyes. Once we've reached the front of the line, I smile as wide as I can. Mitsuko still has not taken off her shades. She hands one woman a card and receives an armful of envelopes. When she's asked if she needs a basket, Mitsuko declines. That's what he's for, she says, nodding at me. My kind of woman, says a lady behind the counter, chuckling. On the drive back, I ask Mitsuko what her home in Tokyo is like, and she raises an eyebrow before she says, It's quiet. Nearly 3 weeks in, it's almost astounding how little Mitsuko and I have talked about her son. And when I tell her this, she shakes her head. What is there to discuss? She says. What could you possibly tell me? I asked you once already and you gave me nothing. He came out of my body. He's a homosexual. He left his mother with a stranger. I've got everything that I need to know. She's sitting at the table, scrolling through her tablet. I'm in the kitchen, leaning over the stove. I don't know, I say. Exactly, says Mitsuko. You don't know, so don't worry about it. Maybe you could tell me a story, I say, and Mitsuko actually laughs. A story is an heirloom, she says. It's a personal thing. Okay, I say. You don't ask for heirlooms, they're given to you. Okay. Check the rice, says Mitsuko. I figure she's just cutting me off, but then I look at the stove and it's bubbling.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to reading your novel.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And thanks to everybody who joined us today in welcoming our new members. And don't forget that 1 week from today is our annual banquet. Check your email for the registration information. I understand that the slots are filling up fast, so we want to make sure everybody has a chance to join us. Thanks to all. Have a wonderful Saturday.
Well, I just want to say, we once again have got fabulous taste. These were amazing readings.